Contrary, thank you. Carried. Thank you. Rosemary, you're presenting the overview.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'd just like to draw attention to a few particular points through the report. Council has 152 housing units, mostly bed sits and one bedrooms, across 5 different locations around Rotorua. And we've been looking at the issue around the sustainability of that housing. There's been some changes recently, and local government is not eligible to be a community housing provider, which is the way that community housing providers access the income-related rent subsidies for social housing tenants. So we've been doing some initial investigations as per our sustainable living strategy actions. So that was initial data review, looking across the housing continuum and starting to understand some of the trends and history into right across the continuum. And we've had a contractor engaged to look at some initial ideas around what a community housing provider trust might look like in Rotorua. So the drivers of this is the sustainable living strategy has a key objective area around housing, which includes social housing for our pensioners, and looking at that, and also one of Council's 2016 priorities being sustainable infrastructure and affordable, effective council services. Some of the issues facing council around our pensioner units are around the cost of their refurbishment and any improvement, the requirement to retain ownership of those that we have a loan against, holding on to those in order not to have to pay the loan back. We inadvertently provide social support to our tenants but aren't actually well equipped to do so, despite some pretty excellent staff actually. We're not eligible to be a community housing provider, and so we can't attract the income-related rent subsidy, which results in below market rent received by council, and consideration of other strategic properties which might be part of a bigger picture. There's definitely some opportunities emerging. I've been looking at what other councils and other people have been doing in the social housing area, and our contractor found that there was certainly a strong interest in our community to respond to the demand for housing. We've proposed a continuum model of housing, which is really just to understand that each part of the sector has flow-on effects to others, so that when we have a lot of people investing in property here from outside, or a sudden change in mortgage rules, all of those things have impacts which flow on to other bits and the impacts of supply and demand in the different parts of the market. There's some information there around the process around how community housing providers are actually formed, and the rules about that. And we've done an assessment there of the Local Government Act Section 17A assessment, just comparing two options: delivering community housing in-house versus as a pure community housing provider trust, and just doing a bit of a comparison there. And the options, we talked to Tompkins Wake and got a legal opinion on some of our options, just for some other issues that we wanted advice on. And the options we recommend, we've looked at and put up here are based on that legal opinion. So the recommended option is around us investigating and developing a business case to create a community housing provider trust, but noting that any proposal would require much wider community consultation in line with significance and engagement policy. And the proposal would need to consider the models. There's still an awful lot of work that will need to be done to develop that up. The other option is the status quo, and this isn't recommended because it's not going to address the need for funding for future improvement or increased capacity. And an outright sale is not recommended. That option. During our community engagement on sustainable living strategy was a very strong opinion that social housing for our pensioners was a very important aspect of services, but this is really about finding a way to do that in a sustainable way going forward that will meet people's needs, and looking at who the other partners are who might be able to help us do that. To date, there's been very preliminary investigation and talking to people, certainly not exhaustive. That would need to happen. There need to be a full communications plan, talking to all the potential partners and people impacted in any way, and potential investors and so on. I have spoken directly with our staff so that they're in the picture about what's being talked about, and there's no surprises, and I also sent a letter to the pensioners early this week to let them know this was being discussed, so that they don't get concerned that they're about to be out on their ear or anything like that, because that's certainly not intended. And in the back here, just to explain what the attachments are, they're sort of given examples. Attachment 1, the new system, is really just explaining the relationships between the different departments involved in community housing at the moment, because it is quite complex. There's different government departments have different responsibilities for how that all goes together. So it's just to give you a bit of an idea about what's involved there. Attachment 2, again, is just really explaining how the income-related rent subsidy works for community housing providers. Attachment 3, the housing continuum, is quite a nice little graphic really from Community Housing Aotearoa, and our model's based on that understanding as well. You can see that the area where where councils traditionally have been involved in housing, and the scope in which community housing organisations might be involved in a wider scope of supporting activities. And the fourth attachment is the example our contractor developed as a potential Rotorua model. So it's just illustrating some of the relationships and concepts that might come into how this might happen in Rotorua. And attachment 5 is the letter from Tompkins Wake with their advice to us. So that's really the key points, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Rosemary. And I'm sure councillors would have found this very interesting reading. Last year I was in the United States, in San Francisco and Seattle, and looked at social housing there, so it's really interesting to see that we're not going to just take off and leave social housing to sink or swim. So thank you for this. I know there'll be lots of questions to ask. Councillor Maxwell.
Madam Chair, is this still just at question time and then debate later?
Oh yes, questions please, thank you, yes.
Questions. Thank you for the comprehensive report. I was pleased to hear you say that it's very important that we're still involved in pensioner housing, and so the question that I had is that so the purpose of bringing on a partner or a provider so that they could get this something subsidy to help them with their rents, and that it's not a sort of us going out. It's not like an Auckland situation when they were taken out and look at the housing problems they have up there.
No, it's, the idea is that if for instance, we formed some partnership and we put our pensioner housing into some kind of trust at arm's length with other community partners, it would enable that trust to be a community housing provider and get an income-related rent subsidy. So they'd actually be able to charge commercial rent on what they're renting out, and the top-up comes for the tenants from the government. So that makes it a more viable proposition for developing and investing in those properties. And there are also other investors interested in that area who it wouldn't end up being just our pensioner housing. That might just be the very start of it, and it would enable other investors to develop and get look at other needs, including homeless issues, or not just pensioners but other people with housing needs.
You, Councillor Hunt.
Thank you, Rosemary, for a very thorough report. Mine's really about the consultation. Would we go for a special consultative process, or would we wrap that in the annual plan discussions coming up because of its relevance under the significance?
I think it's a case of question of timing, and I think we'd be hard pressed to come back in time with this investigation for it to go into the current annual plan timetable. So, and I think this is probably of a magnitude and significance that it's worth having its own separate process to work its way through. So that's probably what it is way too short a timetable for the annual plan process.
Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Rosemary, thanks for your report. It was made good reading. The question I have for you with regard to your pursuit of a partnership type arrangement, and that's really good, but consequently, what do you see the council's dollar commitment coming in here?
So we have, a full business case. We haven't even started looking at that yet, but I think the idea is that we might perhaps long-term lease our pensioner housing into the trust. So I think that would be more around that capital investment rather than other financial inputs at this time. I guess the other potential partners, there's a number of other examples for us to learn from, and I think it's finding out what the other partners could put in, how that would come together as a business model. But I've certainly had indications from others that the capital enables us to, and it would enable a trust to leverage other investment.
Thank you. Councillor Gould, then Your Worship.
Chair. Thank you, Rosemary, for your report this afternoon. Any of the 5 parcels of land which council used for pensioner housing, are they affected by any Treaty of Waitangi claims or iwi claims?
I don't believe so, and I don't believe any of this would actually change the current ownership model that's being considered. I think what Rosemary highlighted to you, that probably the way we would consider this is that these are our 152 housing units, and that we would be in effect leasing them to someone else to manage on our behalf, so managed into this trust, so that they, as a community housing provider, could then charge the low rent that we currently do, but would be in a position then to pick up the government subsidy for that rent and then use that within a trust and with its other partners to actually expand the provision of services that are provided to the tenants at this location and potentially expand that. So we're moving away from sort of a zero-sum equation where we have 152 units that we just make enough money to look after, to a situation where we can use ours into a trust and with government support that we're not eligible for, to leverage it for a much wider community outcome with those partners. So we're not actually talking about the transfer of ownership in what's being proposed here. It's more of a case of a long-term lease or management of our current units within a CHP.
Your Worship.
I thank you for this, and it's really good timing to get this early in the triennial, because it'll take a while to develop and needs to be seen in the context of a district-wide housing plan. So this is the social housing component of a district-wide housing plan. And the other aspect in here, very early, another partner would have to be the Department of Housing and Building, because we're not yet seen as a fast growth area for a special housing zone. But there is emerging pressures on infrastructure with our growth, where we need, and our Minister Flavel's asked us to let him know when we're moving in this direction, because he sees it as an economic growth opportunity too. So I think we need a partner from the Crown somewhere in here so that we can optimise all revenue that we could possibly get, because we don't straddle that special housing zone yet. And you don't want to wait till you're there, till you start the planning. So I think this is great, but really early in the piece, I think we need to involve someone from central government as well.
Councillor Kent, then Councillor Sturt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your report. There's a couple of areas that concern me. First being the fact that there is a 20-year loan from the Housing Corporation that doesn't have to be paid back unless we sort of part company with them. Now, we're in a sort of rather invidious position that if we sort of move into an arrangement whereby we're technically not anymore providing the service, are we going to be facing a scenario of having to repay that loan back? Because for 1.532 million, we can do a fair bit of maintenance on the properties. So that's the first area of contention that I think has to be looked at very closely. And the second one is our note in point 8 of Tonkin Wake's legal advice, is that there are conditions to the formation of CHP, one of which is that the government funding subsidies do not apply except to new tenants. So there would have to be protection for existing tenants to ensure that whoever moved in there didn't oust them just so that they could actually get the government subsidies. And the third area of concern to me is also pointed out in 21 of Tonkin Wake's opinion, where it's talking about the rights of landlords derived from the terms of the lease and loss of control and direction and the ability to influence a service provider taking over and doing it. So there's 3 areas there that are of concern to me.
Okay, so a couple of things. So long as council retains ownership of that property, then there's no issue around paying back the loan. It would only be if we sold it, is my understanding, that would be a problem. The current tenants, no, this is one of the issues to work through. Is the current tenants, because they're currently housed, if those units went into a trust, that no, they wouldn't automatically attract the income related to rent subsidy. And my colleagues in Christchurch explained their process with that is that, and we do have a turnover rate per year, but it does have to be factored in that you don't attract that on your current tenants immediately. But if there's about a 30% turnover every year, and obviously some people stay for a very long time and don't turn over, but it is something that has to be borne in mind. Absolutely, it is a difficult point. And I think your other question was about the... Right. Okay, so in order to be a community housing provider, there's a whole lot of requirements of that trust as to what would be required, and I think that would give quite a lot of surety about the purpose of it and what it can and can't do. But I think that would be where I'm sure council would still want to have some interest. It may not be a controlling interest, and I think it's where it needs to be less than 50% in order for it to be recognised a community housing provider with council interest. So yeah, there's a number of things to definitely to work through and things to be aware of and setting that up.
The other aspect of control, Councillor Kent, which we would have to just tease out during this process, is if we retain the management, the ownership of the asset, but we assign it as a long-term lease across to the community housing provider to achieve a range of social outcomes, we would also be stipulating our requirements in that lease. So that would be our way of controlling how those properties were being used. So certainly for our 152, if we were to lease them across, there would be our way of managing through that with a assignment contract.
Mr. Stewart?
Thank you for the report. I need to ask, I just see this as a conduit for a trust to access government money. Currently, our tenants pay a certain percentage of their income anyway, and so I want to know, well, what's in it for the trust? You say they can access the government money to build up capital to provide more housing, but they would want to be in a commercial type situation, and I want to know how many of our current tenants pay 25% of the income. I don't think many of them would. So they're going to face increases. I mean, we need to know that, and this is a wonderful scheme for new community housing. I've got no problem with that, but for the existing community housing, based on the fact that we've got a mortgage, we've got to service that as well. So where's the income for that? Is that from the lease money? So if we're attracting lease money from a leasee, they are charging market rents, they're getting the government subsidy. I mean, one of the problems we've had has been able to not raise capital, but get any further government input into extending the number of units down there, and they're just not. We just don't qualify now. I understand. So I think it might be a hammer and a nut situation again.
Do you want to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's actually a very complex thing, but there certainly are other, also not altruistic, other community investors who are not interested in getting a commercial return, but are interested in the social return as well as, a very small financial return on investment. So I think that it is something that needs a full business case pulled together with actually looking at who the other potential partners are. And I'm not making any assumptions about who they might be because, the Christchurch Council have taken one approach. There's a Tauranga Community Housing Trust at the moment that we'd want to talk to and learn from. There's things that happen in Auckland and other places, so I think there's a lot of people to talk to learn from, as well as looking at just what the situation is here, what's possible.
Well, this was established in response to the government selling off the state housing stock. And the reality is, in some of the places where what we call pensioner housing stock is certainly not the place to have screaming kids and families in a quiet area. So, yeah, I'll be watching this. I think the jury's out on whether this is effective in terms of increasing
community housing, low-cost, affordable houses, because there has to be a profit in there somewhere for us to get lease money, and for the trust to get enough capital so the money cycle goes around. So, I'll wait
Thank
till
you.
I see the business case. Thank you.
Thank you. You wanted to make a comment?
If I can make one comment, and Rosemary's already alluded to this, is that social housing invariably has or is used by some of the most vulnerable people sometimes in our community. And that means effectively they bring with them not just housing needs, they have a raft of needs,
Social needs.
that are attached. As an organisation, we just simply do not have the ability to address those needs, although we are doing so, as Rosemary indicated, in an almost ad hoc manner because of because of the care and nature of our own staff. They tend to work with people and try and do what they can. The advantage of this sort of arrangement is that there is nothing stopping an NGO, such as a social housing provider, also seeking to be a contractor with the DHB around mental health services or home services and so on, and to extend their broad range of services in a way that housing is only one aspect of service provision that they provide. So home assistance right through to some type of home care availability is an option around this sort of model. And that's, to me, is the key attractor for it. The whole idea, I think, therefore, being we don't necessarily see ourselves so much as providing a housing initiative, but an initiative that is actually targeted to some of our most vulnerable people, and an initiative that actually doesn't meet their housing needs, but meets a broader range of needs that they present with. So that no, that wouldn't at all be the intent. The other issue that we've also got in the city is housing affordability, and how do we make sure that young families are able to access good quality housing? And that's something that, if you look at the continuum contained in the documentation, that this type of housing provider can also start addressing, to say, how do we not only provide housing in terms of on the social end of the spectrum, but how can we actually provide affordable housing for people that provides accessibility to people that otherwise may be able to not access housing. So it's a much broader intervention potentially available.
Thank you, Jeff. Ms. Morrison?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question that relates to a comment Councillor Kent said about the loan. And I'm quite curious to see, should the recommendation be passed in the business plan or business case, how the security, or the encumbrance that that loan is upon the properties, how that impacts the community housing provider's ability to leverage the assets in order to get some capital funding. So I'd be just sort of flagging that that's something that would be quite interesting, because that could be quite a fetter on its ability to be successful and sustainable.
I'm not sure if anyone's... Yes, thank you. Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, Rosemary, glad you raised the Tauranga Community Trust. I had a call from a charitable trustee, not from that trust, from a funding trustee this morning, who knew this was on our agenda or had spotted it. And in fact, he gave his name, happy to use it, but it's Bay Trust. So they're working with Tauranga Community Trust, who he tells me have extended their influence into the Eastern Bay as well. And he encourages our council to have a discussion with Alistair Rhodes at the earliest opportunity. And I can go into detail about why later if you don't already know. But So my question was around the item in your report on page 42, and how the reform of social sector housing resulted in our tenants not being able to access the income-related rent subsidy. What is the risk of a further reform and a further change of the rules? That's my only concern around. Is that considered a low risk?
I think once you've become registered as a community housing provider, and obviously you're not a council organisation in order to do that, I'm not sure that once that's established and functioning that it would be very likely that they would change the rules and suddenly disestablish a lot of community housing providers. I would have thought that you'd know that at the outset when you do a business case and actually make an application to be accepted. I would have thought once you're in. I'd be very surprised if they changed that.
So low risk in your opinion?
Yes, you don't know what's likely to come down the pipeline from the government. You know, there could be certainly more changes on the horizon. Mr. Berryman-Kam?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. The question that I've got is that, first of all, I'm quite taken with the diagram of the Rotorua community housing model on page 52, like that graphic. It certainly resonated for me. But whilst I realise that this paper focuses in on the council's pensioner housing issue, my question is, should this committee approve moving to a business case? Will that business case explore a community housing partnership that covers all of those areas outlined on page 52? For instance, I see very little about emergency housing, even though it's specifically identified in the report. So I just want to seek reassurance that if we progress to a business case, it's a business case on community housing with a component that's pensioner flats, but we'll also look at all the other issues raised in the report.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the pensioner housing is one component of particular interest to council, which creates some other opportunities when put together with other partners to have a much wider range of services and possibilities.
Can I just add to that, and I think it picks up on the comment the Chief Executive made earlier about our provision of a level of social services. You know, we operate on that discounted rent basis, so we provide a very low rental, so we're down at that sort of 25%. So because we're not eligible, because the government chooses to exclude council housing as just discounted housing, we are relying on our staff's capabilities to provide some of those social services, which is quite a dangerous situation to be in. So by transferring the management of these properties across and their ability to receive the other 75% of their market value in rental from the Crown, then that would actually provide the opportunity for us to see those social services provided. Now, and we're a very large landlord too, so we're doing that with 150 units. One of the things that's quite exciting about the discussions that have already been had is the number of particularly iwi trusts who may have very small numbers of properties but are equally unable to provide those sort of wraparound services. So coming together under a CHP for management of those properties as well enables you to provide that critical mass to actually provide those wraparound services, and also to look specifically at the provision of emergency housing, not just pensioner or assisted movement up through that continuum. So I think that's the ability of a CHP that's provided with a scale supported by the council's properties to actually make some quite important improvements and actually get some additional value for the community. Because at the moment we're just working on a zero sum. We collect just enough rent to look after our houses just well enough, and we provide just a level of social services or care that's not actually doing anything to address the sort of wider issues across our community. So really this is an important opportunity, an important vehicle to provide some sort of solution to some of the housing problems in the district.
Thank you. There might be some now, rather than just questions. Any further discussion, please? Thank you, Your Worship.
But the only other piece of the puzzle that I have picked up on with the Youth Centre Trust and other youth providers is there is a need for some consideration. No one knows the shape yet or the size of the need, but there are lots of young children that would prefer to live in supported accommodation rather than living at home, which is really sad. So that, you know, as long as we could include those needs as well in here. The Youth Centre Trust was looking at that. MSD provide a contract in Rotorua and Whakatane, and we missed out. So, you know, that's something else that could come in here.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Rosemary Viskovic, for your report. Mine is more discussion rather than question, but it'll probably be some rhetorical questions in there. I see Council is investigating and developing a business plan. I believe it should be a bit more urgent because in 2013, as it says earlier over here, a report was implemented. Well, not implemented, but done. We are in 2016. It's a crisis, I believe, out there. Last year, it highlighted when the motels were kicking the people out because they'd had enough of it. But the motels got into that stage and situation because they got a directive from Flavel, Mr. Flavel, to house them, find them a housing. And everybody knows what else followed, so I don't need to go into detail. And a lot of people, my point is that a lot of people that didn't really qualify for it from within town came into that situation. And that's where the abuses. I'd just like to see that we urgently respond to this rather than getting another report developed, another investigation done, because there are some serious crises there. And I've gone and seen the condition of some of the flats, and I'll tell you what, none of us would go and live in it. So let's have a bit more empathy than let's talking about this vision. Let's, you know, rather than discussing profit and loss situation, let's closely look at this and say, how can we bring this matter to an urgent resolution? Because there is a serious crisis there.
Thank you, and we are open for discussion at this point. I'd just like to make some observations that housing, community housing, social housing is quite an emotive topic in this country today, and even our central government can't get a good handle on it. There's a lot of misinformation out there. We talk about a housing crisis in the country. That is in fact not the case. We do have a crisis in terms of mental health issues, those such folk trying to find accommodation, and that raises all sorts of issues. It's quite right that the report highlights that our staff do not have the specialist skill to handle some significant social issues that come with people who are vulnerable and who are seeking housing. So I actually have to ask myself now. Of course, we've had our pensioner housing for many years, but of course you qualify now in terms of our houses for age 55, from age 55. So you know some of those people could be in those houses for 30 odd years, and I suspect some of them probably have by now. But I would like to think that we're actually going to look at why do we need to be in the business of being a landlord in future? Because we wouldn't be overly good at it. Don't think we are. We provide houses. We can't provide some of the other social support. We're wanting to establish a community housing provider partnership. Maybe we should look to a partner to actually think about, hey, you take it over altogether. Because I don't think we haven't really looked at that. I see what we've done. We've compared this. We've compared a housing provider with the retention of ownership, you know, and council ownership. But I just really wonder if we shouldn't also be looking at what if we said, well, there's somebody else take it over in its entirety. Because that's, I mean, we obviously haven't. We're looking more at seeking a partnership with a provider, aren't we? Really, more than.
I think there may well be a community housing trust that forms almost without us, and we lease property into it. We may not be part of it. I think it's really to get some direction from council as to us investigating all those options and coming back to you with a model that seems to fit for here.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Kumar.
Why do we just have to, Madam Chair, why do we just have to look at one trust? We can use multiple bilateral structures. Yesterday we went on a field trip and we saw the Budicon partnership. I mean, that contradicts what we're trying to do. Here we've already are landlords, and we've got, and that is co-council business, always has been for so many years. And now to completely go away from it, when we are trying to, what I believe is, on some instances, probably not council business, co-council business, sister cities and all this kind of stuff. We're trying to establish more of the stuff which is not relevant and important to us in our life, and the people that are part of our society, that need our assistance and help, that have always been part of co-council business, now we're trying to push them away. That's my opinion.
No, I don't believe anybody at this council table is trying to push them away. What we are trying to do is to look at what we can really do over a long period of time to ensure that they're safe, they're less vulnerable, and there's some surety of accommodation for them in the future. But on the continuum, we've got people who are extremely vulnerable to others who are quite capable but just need good, safe accommodation. And to be surrounded by possibly like people as well, or people that they feel comfortable living around. So thank you for that. It's good discussion. Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to answer Councillor Kumar there, this to me looks to be the exact parallel of the Budicon model, in that we actually own the premises and we're looking to actually find someone to run it properly and do the job properly rather than us trying to do the whole issue. And to come back to the Chair's comment earlier about why we don't divest the lot, well, that point was raised earlier. It's going to cost us 1.5 million lost funding if we do. So that is very strongly a reason to continue to retain ownership and actually look at the leasing structure.
Yes. Councillor Donaldson?
I was going to put recommendation to Madam Chair, move it, and in response to Councillor Kumar, simply say the reason council needs to be less involved in this or have less influence in the structure is so that the income subsidy can be achieved, the government income subsidy. So I think it's pretty clear from the report that we need have no controlling influence in whatever the structure is. I think it's great initiative to move forward with, and I agree with Councillor Kumar's calls for urgency. So I'm happy to move.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Councillor Hunter seconded. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Oh, yes, certainly. Thank you.
I do support this, and I think that when we first got into pensioner housing all those years ago, it was to resolve what was seemed as a fairly simple problem of finding homes for people who didn't have the financial wherewithal to have one themselves. The problems have got far more complex in this day and age, and it requires a multi sort of disciplinary action to support that. That isn't council's role, but we can be one of those partners, and I think that the government has noticed that by setting up the that act, I think it is, the Tenancy under the Housing Provider Regulations Act, recognise that it is something that communities need to develop and open up wider. So we'll get the professionals in, we'll be a partner in there with our buildings, we'll house our community, we'll open up some other aspects of other land, and I think that once it comes back to us, and ideally, that was my question about would it be done in time to do the annual plan, because it is urgent. However, it will need to be worked up properly, and it may well take longer than that. So I'm glad it's before us now, because that we are able, if this passes, to push the go button on this report, and it signals to the community that we care deeply about those who are vulnerable, and it's a wider conversation and requires skills from many other people other than just council, and to access that funding, so I fully support it.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hunt. It's been moved by Councillor Donaldson, seconded by Councillor Hunt, that the committee recommends to Council to support in principle option 1, that Council investigate and develop a business case for the creation of a community housing provider trust, noting any proposal may require wider community consultation in line with Council's significance and engagement policy. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye. Thank you. Carried. May I have a mover and seconder, please? Oh, yes, that's right. May I have a mover and seconder, please, that we move into the public excluded? Oh. Thank you. Thank you. That'll be recorded as so noted. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Kent. We've moved into... thank you, Councillor Tapsell. It's been moved and seconded that we go into public excluded. We have 3 confidential items to be discussed, namely the exchange of reserve land, the Utahina stream, enterprise resource planning, and the disposal of surplus property. The reason for these items to be considered in public excluded is to enable any local authority holding the information to carry on without prejudice or disadvantage negotiations, including commercial and industrial negotiations. So I'll put that motion that we go into public excluded. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you, carried.